अस्सलाम वालेकुम, मेरा नाम इरम परवीन बिलाल है और मैं एक पाकिस्तानी फ़िल्म मेकर हूँ। अम, मेरा बैकग्राउंड साइंस और इंजीनियरिंग से था, लेकिन मुझे बहुत जल्दी इस बात का एहसास हो गया कि कहानियों में एक ऐसा इम्पैक्ट है जो शायद मेरे लिए एक साइंस वाली ज़िंदगी में नहीं ना होता। I am a proud founder of a screenwriting lab called Kalambaz. That is, it's in year 7, Pakistan's first script writing lab, and we have now expanded to other South Asian countries. And I also initiated the formation of the Oscar committee that Sharmeen is running now. I'm so proud of these two initiatives. And yeah, I just made a film called I'll Meet You There, Bismil, that is in release currently globally, and inshallah, I hope that you get to see it and that you get to support artists. I started writing this current film in film school, which was over a decade ago. And, right then it was right close, like 5, 6 years after 9/11. And, the ideas and the concepts, it was my first script. So, of course, it was very shallow. But I think with time, the whole notion of the 9/11 thing had been so overdone in terms of film. And I really wanted to talk about what was going on within the Muslim community after 9/11, which is sort of the forces of sort of Protestant Islam and born again Islam, and just this idea of how we within the community have suddenly felt like we need to define what camp we're in the face of these more giant geopolitical, socio-political rather, forces. So there was that aspect. And then obviously with time, the notion of sort of dance and having parts of my family become very conservative about dancing, and just like family weddings, suddenly you're having to tell when music and dance is happening so people can leave. And it's just all this very sort of conservative wave was sweeping through the country. And so that was an interesting notion. And then with time, I also feel like in the US, the identity of the Muslim American was evolving. And, now thankfully, we're in an age where terrorist doesn't mean Muslim to these people, right? Like when they think terrorists, they are also thinking about these white extremists who stormed the Capitol. So it felt like it was time to tell a story about a Muslim American protagonist. And mind you, not even I would say 4 years ago, people were just, like I said, they were like, kuch to galat hona chahiye masjid mein. And you're like, why? So I think that it just, I think that it was sort of time to tell a more, thankfully, I had grown as a filmmaker. And I think society had grown and was ready to actually embrace a Muslim protagonist. So I think telling a nuanced story about evolving identity and sort of evolving ideology was okay. So that is what happened to the film.
Your grandfather is here.
From Pakistan?
I didn't want to see his face after my wife died.
So I want you to clear anything that screams dance. Just like her mother.
What about Ma?
Threw your community under the bus.
For the first time in years, it felt like we had a family.
Diversity, it is, on one hand, you have to kind of use it to be able to get opportunities. And on the other hand, you wish for a very colorblind society where you don't have to talk about your identity and you're just celebrated as a human being with a validated lived experience. But we live in a world where there has been so much systemic oppression, not just in the US, even in Pakistan, everywhere in the world, there's been so much systemic oppression, specifically of women, and then minority groups, right? So now being a woman and then being outside of Pakistan where there's homogeneity of color, there is the aspect of color as well, जो आ जाता है. तो आप एक खातून हैं, you're not white. और फिर आप एक फिल्म इंडस्ट्री में हैं जो कि सिस्टेमिकली अगेन वी नो कि फिल्में बनाना जो है वो ज़्यादातर अमीरों का या पीपल विद रिसोर्सेज, those are the people who are able to really tell stories. So all of that of course affects, it affects us, the type of stories that can get greenlit, and which is why it is not a coincidence कि अक्सर जो ख़वातीन हैं, they are operating in the independent film space. By the way, even in Pakistan, most of the female filmmakers are operating in the independent space because the powers that be are so obsessed with trying to crack what commercial is and they presume that ख़वातीन जो हैं वो commercial नहीं बना सकती. और मेरा ये शुरू से ये मुद्दा रहा है कि जो ऑडियंस चाहती है वो कमर्शियल होता है, जो आप सोचते हैं ऑडियंस चाहती है वो ज़रूरी नहीं है कि कमर्शियल होता है. तो हमने अपनी तरफ से मसाला बना दिया है कि दिस इज़ व्हाट फॉर्मूला इज़ एंड दिस इज़ व्हाट द ऑडियंस वांट्स. बट एक जो हेल्दी फिल्म इंडस्ट्री होती है उसमें हर तरह की पिक्चर्स का एक स्पेस होता है और इस तरह से आप माशरे के साथ इंगेज भी करते हैं और माशरा भी एजुकेट होता है और आप एज एन इंडस्ट्री भी एजुकेट होते हैं. एंड दैट इज़ द साइन ऑफ अ हेल्दी फिल्म इंडस्ट्री. नाउ दैट इज़ समथिंग दैट सॉर्ट ऑफ सिनेमैटिक thing is very difficult, I think, across the world, because now cinema is also tackling with the impacts of technology. So whilst a lot more films are being made, there's a lot more new avenues of distribution of films. So all of that to round back and say that जो power है वो financing में होती है और distribution में होती है. एंड इन सम वेज वो दोनों जो हैं थोड़े से लेवल प्लेइंग फील्ड हो गए हैं वीज़ा वी क्राउड फंडिंग और प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट और स्ट्रीमिंग OTT प्लेटफॉर्म्स, जिसके वजह से पर्सन ऑफ कलर होना थोड़ा सा ज़्यादा फैशनेबल है आजकल और वुमेन ऑफ कलर होना भी थोड़ा सा फैशनेबल है. लेकिन डज दैट रिफ्लेक्ट इन द सिस्टम्स ऑफ पावर? I don't think so yet. I still think that women of color are largely, and women, ignored. You know, coming from a certain community and, you know, having the gender, the racial, the religious sort of labels that I have, yes, it absolutely puts an expectation of the type of stories that I can tell. For example, we don't quite often question authentic authorship of, you know, films that are, now we are starting to, films that are made by the Caucasian filmmakers. But for example, like if Danny Boyle can go and make Slumdog, you know, not as many people would question him, right? But tomorrow, if I want to go and make a film about Marilyn Monroe, I mean, people are just going to be like, well, why? Why are you the person to tell this story? And so this is a stigma that, you know, there's this burden. There's this burden not just in the film side of things, there's a burden on the political side of things, where if anything happens that has to do with sort of like a brown or a Muslim or a Pakistani side, it feels like it's a burden of the whole community. Like we are somehow like guilty until proven innocent. Similarly, I think in media, you know, we are expected to propagate a certain notion. Now, for example, when I was making this film, I constantly kept getting in the system feedback like, well, something's not wrong in the mosque. So like, what's the payback? And I'm just like, well, why would I be telling that story? You're all telling that story all the time. And then the other thing that I found really interesting is that they would keep kind of saying that it's not big enough. And then in other words, they would say that the white characters are not fleshy enough. And since the majority of the meaty roles are brown people, so it's really hard and it's a small film. So this, because of this sort of systemic cycle of they will not fund narratives that they don't think are big, and we like all people of color narratives are considered small, despite how many outliers they are, they keep pushing the system to not recognize that, you know, people of color stories are as valid as non-people of color stories, right? And so then they will also not pick you up for distribution because they'll say, oh, it's too small. And I keep saying, well, if you funded it in the first place, it wouldn't have been that small. We just decided to go make it smaller because we didn't have the funds. So this is a very sort of typical catch-22 way of not blessing certain narratives and keeping others, you know. So for example, in my film, you don't see an oppressed Muslim woman. So that just like, you know, people were just like confused. They didn't know what to do with it. They're like, is this realistic? And FBI doesn't come into the mosque. And I'm like, yeah, they do. Look at all these like metrics and documentaries about it. And so again, it isn't in the interest of the giant narrative sometimes to support certain viewpoints and certain narratives. So yes, I mean, we would be lying if we said that there isn't stigma in terms of the diaspora or sort of the Pakistani community. Of course, there's stigma, and which is why quite often some artists also have to kind of compromise in their voices in order to get a larger systemic stamp of approval. It's complicated. I think it's taking time. It's evolving, but it's always slower than we want it to be. I think that this is something where I have this discussion with my fellow peers, artist peers a lot, which is that there's this notion कि भाई आपका काम आर्ट बनाना है, आप आर्ट बनाए और बनाते रहें. मैं ये कहती हूँ कि भाई जंगल में मोर नाचा किसने देखा? तो अगर आपने 2 साल लगा दिए, 3 साल लगा दिए, 5 साल लगा दिए एक पिक्चर बनाने में, unfortunately it is your burden to get it out there in the world, because the systems that are to distribute are hugely flawed and failing and are not able to really optimize themselves in a very vibrantly changing market. So you as an artist know your audience the best. Unfortunately, as much as we don't want that, because as an artist you're your own brand ambassador, you're also writing, you're directing, you're marketing. I mean, it's exhausting, right? This is not easy work. The whole point of telling stories is to create empathy, as far as I'm concerned. For me, I tell stories because I want to understand human beings in a better way. Sometimes it's almost easier to do research on characters and interact with people whilst writing a screenplay, as opposed to head on asking somebody on why they do things a certain way, right? So I think that for me, telling stories is an exploration of the human being, and trying to shine a light on the complexities and the shades of gray in how we are, who we are, and to prevent judgment and sort of like this black and white extremist point of view that this world is so growing towards, that, you know, I'm right and you're wrong. So of course, telling a story about a minority is going to create empathy and possibly going to create the other side to want to invest in learning more, right? So for example, with I'll Meet You There, that is called Bismil in Urdu, from the word Raqsim, Bismil. It is, at the surface of it, it is about a family trying to reconnect. So they happen to be Muslim, they happen to be living in Chicago, but the hope is that after watching the film, you know, audiences are like, wow, this is just like my relationship with my father or my grandfather or my daughter, and I want to call my grandfather and my daughter, but also like, oh, that Muslim family living across the street, maybe tomorrow I can take a tray of muffins to them. Maybe we can talk. Maybe I can ask them, like, you know, oh, I never thought your community faces this. So of course, storytellings are the softest, or one of the softest powers of community building. And so it's a no-brainer, right? I mean, now in a climate like Pakistan, if we're talking about telling stories of minorities, I think the problem, and the challenge that we have, is that you can create these stories, but they need to be distributed. And that is where the power is cut, right? So it isn't a coincidence that it's so difficult to distribute, because in distribution lies the power of media. And wherever there is power of perception changing, you have forces that are immediately sort of, you know, aligned in a political side of things. So creating content is one thing, but really distributing this type of content on a mass way is where the real change lies. So it's not just storytellers. I think it's distributors who have to get on board and support stories that are diverse, whether in the US or in Pakistan, if there's really an honest intention to build bridges. This notion that filmmakers are in this for sort of fame and riches is kind of nonsensical. So I really wish that our society at large learns to respect the artist a little more, and builds an education of the arts along sciences, because I truly believe that a successful society can only occur if imagination, creativity, and innovation are breathed into our next generations. And that innovation doesn't necessarily mean in tech only. It also means in storytelling and representation, because quite often the hardest subjects can really be communicated through stories. So we cannot keep thinking of films as this other thing that exists separate to us. We are a species that has told stories from the beginning of time, and we need to start respecting them more.